Behind the legendary opening speech and George C. Scott's commanding performance lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, historical ironies, and unexpected controversies. From a general fighting tanks named after himself to Nixon's obsessive viewing habits and revolutionary sound techniques involving echoing trumpets, this World War II epic conceals some of Hollywood's strangest behind-the-scenes stories. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Patton. Fact 1. German tanks were actually Pattons. When you watch the tank battles in Patton, you're witnessing one of the most ironic situations in film history. Every single German tank rolling across the screen is actually an American M48 Patton tank, named directly after the very general George C. Scott is portraying. This means that throughout the entire movie, General Patton is essentially fighting to destroy tanks that bear his own name. The production team faced a unique challenge when they began filming in 1969. They needed authentic World War II equipment for the massive battle sequences, but the United States military had long since retired or scrapped most of their wartime vehicles. The solution came from an unexpected source. Francisco Franco's Spanish army still maintained a large fleet of American-made tanks from the post-war era, including hundreds of M48 Patton tanks that had been supplied under military assistance programs. The Spanish military was happy to rent out their equipment and troops to the Hollywood production, which consumed nearly half of the film's $12 million budget. The art department painted German markings and desert camouflage on these M48 Patton tanks, complete with iron crosses and Wehrmacht identification numbers. They even removed the distinctive muzzle brakes and added camouflage netting to disguise their true identity. But military vehicle enthusiasts can still easily spot the characteristic features of the Patton tank design. The irony runs even deeper when you consider that the M48 was specifically named to honor General George S. Patton's revolutionary contributions to armored warfare tactics. The tank entered service in 1952, 7 years after Patton's death, as a tribute to his mastery of mechanized combat. So, in the film, audiences watch dramatized versions of Patton's greatest victories achieved by defeating the very war machines that were created to commemorate his legacy. This bizarre twist of military hardware creates what might be the only instance in cinema history where a biographical subject literally battles against equipment bearing his own name, turning every tank engagement into an unintentional metaphor for self-destruction. Fact 2. Nixon's obsessive White House screenings. President Richard Nixon's fascination with Patton went far beyond a casual movie night at the White House. According to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's book, The Final Days, Nixon became completely obsessed with the film after his first viewing on April 5, 1970, just 2 months after its theatrical release. Nixon initially watched Patton with his family in the White House Family Theater, but that single screening wasn't nearly enough to satisfy his growing fixation. Over the following month, the president repeatedly forced his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to sit through multiple viewings of the 3-hour epic, turning what should have been casual entertainment into mandatory presidential policy. The most bizarre incident occurred during a cruise on the USS Sequoia, the official presidential yacht that sailed the Potomac River. Nixon insisted that Kissinger join him for yet another screening of Patton, while they were supposed to be conducting important government business on the water. Kissinger later wrote about this uncomfortable experience with barely concealed sarcasm, noting that it was the second time he had so honored me with a forced viewing of the film. Even more telling was Kissinger's admission that despite Nixon's insistence that the movie was inspiring, he managed to escape for an hour in the middle of it to prepare for the next day's National Security Council meeting. This suggests that even Nixon's top advisor found the president's obsession with films somewhat excessive and inappropriate given their pressing governmental responsibilities. The repeated screenings became so frequent that Nixon's staff began to recognize the pattern of presidential behavior. The film seemed to tap into something deep within Nixon's personality, perhaps his own complicated relationship with authority, military power, and controversial leadership decisions. Nixon's identification with the rebellious, uncompromising general created an unusual situation where the most powerful man in America repeatedly sought inspiration from a Hollywood portrayal of military defiance making Patton essentially required viewing for anyone in Nixon's inner circle. Fact 3. Scott refused his own opening scene. The most iconic scene in Patton almost never happened because George C. Scott flat out refused to film it. When Scott learned that director Franklin J. Schaffner planned to use the famous speech in front of the giant American flag as the opening sequence, he immediately balked at the idea and told the production team he wouldn't do it. Scott's concern wasn't about the content of the speech itself, but rather about the strategic placement within the film's structure. He genuinely believed that if audiences saw him deliver such a powerful, commanding performance right at the beginning of the movie, nothing else he did for the remaining 2.5 hours would be able to match that level of intensity and impact. In Scott's mind, starting with such a memorable scene would essentially doom the rest of his carefully crafted portrayal to feel like a letdown by comparison. The speech itself was a masterpiece of writing, combining actual quotes from General Patton's various addresses to his troops into one cohesive, blood-stirring monologue. Francis Ford Coppola had assembled these authentic Patton quotes into what would become one of cinema's most quoted speeches, filled with lines about cutting out the enemy's guts and using them to grease tank treads. Director Schaffner found himself in a difficult position because he knew the speech was perfect for opening the film, but he also needed his star actor to actually perform it. So Schaffner resorted to an outright lie to get Scott to cooperate. He told Scott that the flag speech would be moved to the end of the film instead, convincing the reluctant actor that it would serve as a powerful conclusion rather than an overwhelming beginning. Scott believed Schaffner's deception and agreed to film the scene, delivering the performance with his full commitment and intensity. Only later did Scott discover that the director had always intended to use the speech as the opening sequence, but by then the filming was complete and the scene had already become the legendary opening that audiences remember today. Fact 4. Revolutionary Echoplex sound technology. Composer Jerry Goldsmith broke completely new ground in film scoring when he used a revolutionary electronic device called an Echoplex to create one of the most haunting and innovative soundtracks in cinema history. The Echoplex was essentially a tape looping machine that could record sounds and play them back with gradually fading echoes, creating an otherworldly effect that had never been heard in movies before. Goldsmith's brilliant idea was to use this technology to musically represent General Patton's deeply held belief that he had lived multiple lives as a warrior throughout history. Patton genuinely believed he had been reincarnated from ancient soldiers who fought in previous wars, and Goldsmith wanted to capture this mystical connection to the past through sound. He recorded trumpet players performing what he called call to war triplets, then fed these recordings through the Echoplex to create ghostly, fading echoes that seemed to drift across time itself. The result was a series of trumpet sounds that appeared to come from distant battlefields, as if the spirits of ancient warriors were calling out across the centuries to their reincarnated comrade. These echoing trumpet calls became a recurring musical theme throughout the film, appearing whenever the story touched on Patton's spiritual beliefs or his connection to military history. The effect was so unique and compelling that it helped establish the Echoplex as a legitimate tool for film composers. Goldsmith's innovative approach didn't stop there. He combined these electronic effects with traditional orchestral elements, including a pipe organ that represented Patton's deep religious faith alongside his military nature. The main theme featured a symphonic march accompanied by the organ, creating a complex musical portrait of a man who was simultaneously a deeply spiritual person and a ruthless warrior. The soundtrack was so groundbreaking that it earned Goldsmith an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score and later became one of the American Film Institute's nominees for the top 25 American film scores of all time. The original soundtrack album even included a bonus track called Echoplex Session that demonstrated the various attempts to perfect this revolutionary sound technique. Fact 5. Military audiences stood at attention. The opening of Patton created an unexpected military situation in theaters across American military bases when soldiers kept jumping to their feet and snapping to attention during what they thought was an actual military command. The film begins in a completely unusual way for a Hollywood movie. With absolutely no studio logo, no opening credits, and no indication that audiences are about to watch a fictional film rather than a real military presentation. Instead of the familiar 20th Century Fox fanfare and logo that moviegoers expected, the screen immediately fills with a massive American flag, and George C. Scott as General Patton strides onto the stage and barks out a commanding "Ten Hut" to address his unseen troops. This abrupt beginning caught military audiences completely off guard, because they had no visual cues to tell them they were watching a movie, rather than witnessing an actual military ceremony or training film. Theater owners at military installations across the United States began reporting a strange phenomenon during the film's early screenings. Soldiers in the audience would automatically leap to their feet and assume the position of attention whenever they heard Scott deliver that opening command, just as they had been trained to do countless times during their military service. Their ingrained military conditioning kicked in before their brains could process that they were sitting in a movie theater watching an actor. The situation became so common that base theater managers had to start making announcements before screenings to warn military personnel that the film would begin immediately with what sounded like a real military command. Some theaters even posted signs outside the screening rooms to alert soldiers that they should remain seated during the opening sequence. This unexpected audience reaction was entirely unintentional on the part of the filmmakers, who had chosen to eliminate the opening credits and studio logo to create a more dramatic and immediate impact. They wanted audiences to feel like they were being directly addressed by General Patton himself, but they never anticipated that their realistic approach would trigger genuine military responses from viewers who had spent years conditioning themselves to respond instantly to commands. Fact 6. Patton's real voice was squeaky. One of the most striking differences between George C. Scott's portrayal and the real General Patton involves something audiences never could have guessed: the actual sound of Patton's voice. While Scott delivered his legendary performance with a deep, gravelly, commanding tone that perfectly matched his intimidating physical presence, the real General George S. Patton had a surprisingly high-pitched, nasal voice that sounded nothing like the Hollywood version. Veterans who actually served under Patton during World War II were startled by this dramatic difference when they saw the film. Many of them commented that while Scott's performance was remarkably accurate in terms of Patton's mannerisms, leadership style, and personality, the voice was completely wrong. Military historian S.L.A. Marshall, who knew Patton personally, specifically noted this major discrepancy between the real general and Scott's interpretation. The real Patton's voice became even more high-pitched and squeaky when he got angry or excited, which happened frequently given his explosive temperament. This meant that during his most famous tirades and motivational speeches, Patton actually sounded more like a frustrated schoolteacher than the booming military commander that audiences imagine. The contrast was so pronounced that some soldiers initially found it difficult to take their new commanding officer seriously when they first heard him speak. Patton himself was apparently aware of this vocal limitation and tried to compensate for it by using extremely colorful and profane language. He believed that his liberal use of profanity would help establish his authority and command presence in ways that his natural voice could not. The general deliberately cultivated his reputation for creative cursing, partly because he understood that his high-pitched voice might otherwise undermine his ability to project the kind of fierce military leadership his position required. This vocal mismatch between reality and the film creates an interesting situation where Scott's powerful voice actually enhanced the dramatic impact of Patton's character, even though it sacrificed historical accuracy for the sake of more effective storytelling and audience engagement. Fact 7. Half the budget went to Spanish military. The production of Patton required such massive military resources that nearly $6 million of the film's $12 million budget went directly to renting equipment and personnel from Francisco Franco's Spanish army. This meant that half of every dollar spent on making the movie was essentially a payment to the Spanish military for their cooperation in creating authentic World War II battle scenes. The arrangement came about because Hollywood faced a unique problem in 1969 when production began. The United States military had long since retired, scrapped, or modernized all of their World War II-era tanks, aircraft, and equipment, making it impossible to find the authentic vehicles needed for the massive battle sequences that director Franklin Schaffner envisioned. Most other NATO countries had similarly moved on from their wartime equipment, leaving the filmmakers with very few options for creating realistic combat scenes. Spain became the perfect solution because Franco's government had maintained large stocks of American-made World War II equipment that had been supplied under various military assistance programs during the 1950s and 60s. The Spanish army still operated hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and other military hardware that were either authentic wartime pieces or close enough to pass for the real thing on camera. The financial arrangement was mutually beneficial for both sides. 20th Century Fox got access to an entire army's worth of equipment and thousands of Spanish soldiers to operate it, while Spain earned millions of dollars that helped fund their military operations. The Spanish troops were paid to act as extras in battle scenes, operate the tanks and vehicles, and essentially serve as a massive film crew for the combat sequences. This unusual partnership meant that Spanish soldiers spent months learning to march in American formations, wear World War II uniforms, and follow Hollywood directors' instructions rather than their own officers' commands. The Spanish military essentially became a subsidiary of a major Hollywood studio, creating one of the most expensive and elaborate military consulting contracts in film history. Fact 8. Real Patton pistols in opening scene. The ivory-handled revolvers that George C. Scott wears on his hips during the famous opening speech weren't Hollywood props at all, but rather the actual pistols that belonged to General George S. Patton himself. The production team managed to borrow these genuine historical artifacts from the museum at the United States Military Academy at West Point in New York, where they were part of the permanent collection honoring the legendary general. These weren't just any ordinary military sidearms, but rather Patton's personal weapons that he carried throughout his World War II campaigns and had become as much a part of his iconic image as his polished helmet and riding boots. The real General Patton was famous for his pair of ivory-handled revolvers, which he wore in custom leather holsters as part of his carefully cultivated image as a larger-than-life military commander. The decision to use the authentic pistols rather than replicas shows the extraordinary lengths that the filmmakers went to achieve historical accuracy in their portrayal. Getting permission to remove these valuable museum pieces from their display cases and transport them to a movie set would have required extensive negotiations with military officials and museum curators, along with significant insurance coverage and security arrangements. For George C. Scott, wearing the actual weapons that Patton had carried into battle must have added an extra dimension of authenticity to his performance. The weight, balance, and feel of the real pistols would have been different from any replica, giving Scott a more genuine connection to the character he was portraying. The ivory handles would have shown the wear marks and scratches from years of military use, making them living pieces of history rather than sterile movie props. After filming was completed, the pistols were returned to their place of honor at West Point, where they continue to be displayed as part of the Academy's collection of military artifacts. Visitors to the museum can still see these same revolvers that appeared in one of Hollywood's most memorable opening scenes, creating a direct link between cinema history and actual military history. Fact 9. Coppola was fired but script survived. Francis Ford Coppola experienced one of Hollywood's strangest career twists when he was fired from writing Patton, only to see the final film use almost everything he had created in his original 1966 screenplay. The young writer had been hired by producer Frank McCarthy and paid $50,000 to spend 6 months crafting a script that would turn General Patton's complex military career into a coherent 3-hour narrative. Coppola was only 26 years old at the time and knew very little about General Patton or the Third Army when he took on the assignment. However, he threw himself into extensive research and created what he believed was a brilliant and unconventional approach to the biographical material. His script included the now famous opening sequence with Patton delivering his speech in front of the massive American flag, a scene that Coppola specifically designed to grab audiences immediately without any traditional opening credits or studio logos. The studio executives were apparently not impressed with Coppola's work and decided to fire him from the project before production began. They brought in veteran screenwriter Edmund H. North to revise and improve what they considered to be an unsatisfactory script from the inexperienced young writer. North was a respected Hollywood professional who had previously worked on successful war films like 12 O'Clock High, making him seem like a safer choice for such an expensive and important production. However, when filming actually started and the final cut was assembled, it became clear that the movie was using most of Coppola's original vision virtually unchanged. The iconic opening speech, the overall structure of the narrative, and many of the key scenes were exactly as Coppola had written them years earlier. Even Coppola himself has admitted in DVD commentary that despite being fired, the final film relied heavily on his original screenplay. This unusual situation meant that Coppola received screen credit and eventually won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, even though the studio had dismissed him from the project. The firing that seemed like a career setback actually helped launch Coppola toward his later successes with films like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. Fact 10. Live chickens were accidentally killed. During the filming of Patton in Spain, an unplanned and unfortunate accident occurred that the filmmakers decided to keep in the final version of the movie. As Patton's military convoy was rolling through a Spanish town that was being used as a filming location, the half-track vehicle carrying George C. Scott accidentally ran over several live chickens that had wandered into the path of the moving vehicles. The incident happened during a scene where Patton and his convoy were making their entrance into what was supposed to represent a North African town that American forces had just liberated. The Spanish location was populated with local residents and their animals, including chickens that were roaming freely through the streets as they would have in any rural Mediterranean community during the 1940s time period the film was depicting. The chickens apparently didn't understand that they needed to stay clear of the large military vehicles rumbling through their territory, and several of them ended up directly in the path of the half-track. The heavy armored vehicle couldn't stop or swerve quickly enough to avoid the birds, resulting in what was essentially an accidental collision between Hollywood filmmaking and Spanish poultry. Rather than stopping production to reshoot the scene or editing out the unfortunate moment, the directors and editors made the decision to leave the accident in the final cut of the film. They apparently felt that the incident added to the authentic, chaotic feel of a military convoy moving through a war-torn area where unexpected obstacles and casualties were simply part of the reality of wartime operations. The chicken incident can be spotted by careful viewers at approximately 16 minutes and 55 seconds into the film, making it one of those unplanned moments that became a permanent part of cinema history. This decision to keep the accident in the movie reflects the production team's commitment to maintaining the gritty, realistic atmosphere they were trying to create, even when that realism came at the expense of some unfortunate Spanish chickens. Fact 11. Stars who rejected the role. Before George C. Scott became forever associated with General Patton, some of Hollywood's biggest stars passed up what would become one of the most acclaimed roles in cinema history. Burt Lancaster, Lee Marvin, Rod Steiger, Robert Mitchum, and Ronald Reagan were all offered the opportunity to play the legendary general, but each of them turned down the part for various reasons that they would later deeply regret. These were not minor actors, but major Hollywood stars at the peak of their careers during the late 1960s. Burt Lancaster had already established himself as a leading man in war films and dramas, while Lee Marvin was known for his tough guy roles and had recently won an Academy Award for Cat Ballou. Rod Steiger was a respected character actor who specialized in intense, dramatic performances, and Robert Mitchum was one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men with a reputation for playing complex, morally ambiguous characters. The most surprising rejection came from Ronald Reagan, who was still an active Hollywood actor at the time before his transition into politics. Reagan had appeared in numerous military films during his career and seemed like a natural fit for the role of a commanding military leader. But he also passed on the opportunity to portray Patton. What makes these rejections particularly ironic is that most of these actors later admitted that turning down Patton was one of the biggest mistakes of their professional lives. After seeing George C. Scott's powerhouse performance and the film's enormous critical and commercial success, including its Academy Award wins for Best Picture and Best Actor, the actors who had rejected the role realized they had missed out on what could have been a career-defining performance. Interestingly, John Wayne was the one major star who actually wanted the role of Patton, but the producers and directors felt he wasn't right for the part. This created a strange situation where the actor who was most eager to play the general was rejected, while multiple actors who were offered the role turned it down, leaving the field clear for George C. Scott to deliver his legendary performance. Fact 12. Bradley secretly hated Patton. One of the most ironic aspects of Patton involves the relationship between the film's technical advisor and the man he was helping to portray on screen. General Omar Bradley served as the senior technical advisor for the production and was paid by 20th Century Fox to ensure military accuracy. Yet according to Patton biographer Carlo D'Este, Bradley actually despised George S. Patton both personally and professionally during their real wartime service together. Throughout the film, Carl Malden's portrayal of Bradley shows him as Patton's loyal friend and trusted colleague, someone who genuinely cared about the controversial general despite his many flaws and outbursts. The movie presents their relationship as a classic military friendship between two officers who respected each other's abilities even when they disagreed on tactics or behavior. This fictional friendship becomes one of the emotional anchors of the film, giving audiences a sympathetic character who could help them understand and relate to Patton's more difficult personality traits. The reality was completely different from this Hollywood version of their relationship. Bradley not only knew Patton well enough to dislike him, but he had developed a deep personal and professional contempt for the man during their actual wartime experiences together. This meant that while Bradley was being paid to help create an accurate and respectful portrayal of Patton's military career, he was simultaneously harboring genuine negative feelings about the subject of the film. The situation becomes even more complex when you consider that parts of the movie's plot were actually taken directly from Bradley's own World War II memoir, A Soldier's Story. Bradley had written about his experiences with Patton from his own perspective, and now he was helping Hollywood transform those same experiences into a sympathetic portrayal of a man he had grown to despise. This created an unusual dynamic where Bradley was essentially being paid to help whitewash his own negative opinions about Patton for the sake of creating better entertainment. The extent of Bradley's influence on the final script remains largely unknown, but his presence as technical advisor adds an extra layer of irony to every scene, showing the fictional friendship between the two generals. Fact 13. 71 locations across 6 countries. The scope of filming for Patton was so massive that the production crew traveled to 71 different locations across 6 countries to capture the authentic settings needed for General Patton's World War II campaigns. This extraordinary logistical undertaking required the filmmakers to essentially follow Patton's actual wartime path across multiple continents, recreating battles and events in locations that could convincingly represent the original historical sites. Spain served as the primary filming location and provided the majority of the 71 sites, including places like Cabo de Gata, Sierra de Urbasa, La Granja, Almería, the Royal Palace of Madrid, Tabernas, La Alcazaba, and La Granja de San Ildefonso. The Spanish locations were particularly valuable because they could double for multiple different regions, with the varied landscapes and architecture allowing the same country to represent North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany depending on the specific terrain and buildings being used. Morocco provided several crucial filming locations including Volubilis, Casablanca, and Rabat, where the production team could capture authentic North African settings and film reviews of actual Moroccan troops that added genuine local flavor to the desert campaign sequences. Greece and Sicily were used for the amphibious landing scenes that depicted the Allied invasions of those territories, giving the filmmakers access to the actual coastlines and beaches where some of the historical events had taken place. England contributed locations including Over Peover in Cheshire, which was used to represent various European settings, while the United States provided the backdrop for the famous opening scene, which was filmed at the Bob Hope Patriotic Hall in downtown Los Angeles, California. Additional scenes were shot in Algeria at Timgad, expanding the geographic scope even further. This international filming approach meant that the production crew had to coordinate transportation of equipment, personnel, and Spanish military assets across multiple countries, dealing with different currencies, languages, customs regulations, and filming permits. The logistical complexity of managing 71 different locations across 6 countries made Patton one of the most geographically ambitious film productions of its era, requiring the kind of international coordination that was more typical of actual military operations than Hollywood movies. Fact 14. Historic Oscar rejection. George C. Scott made Hollywood history by becoming the first actor to refuse an Academy Award, rejecting his Best Actor Oscar for Patton, and famously dismissing the entire ceremony as a 2-hour meat parade victory, but rather the culmination of his long-standing philosophical opposition to the competitive nature of acting awards that he had been expressing publicly for years. Scott had already demonstrated his principles 9 years earlier when he refused his Best Supporting Actor nomination for The Hustler in 1961, sending a telegram to the Academy requesting that his name be withdrawn from consideration. He believed that artistic performances could not and should not be compared against each other like athletic competitions, arguing that every actor's work was unique and deserved to be judged on its own merits rather than ranked against others. When Scott received his Best Actor nomination for Patton in 1971, he again sent advance notice to the Academy that he would not accept the award if he won. His telegram stated that he respectfully requested his name be withdrawn from the nominee list, and that his request was not intended to insult his fellow actors. The Academy ignored his wishes and kept his name on the ballot anyway, setting up the dramatic confrontation that would occur on awards night. When presenter Goldie Hawn opened the envelope and announced that George C. Scott had won the Academy Award for Best Actor, Scott was nowhere to be found in the audience. He was spending the evening at his farm in upstate New York, deliberately avoiding the ceremony that he had criticized so harshly. Producer Frank McCarthy accepted the Oscar statue on Scott's behalf during the televised broadcast, but in keeping with Scott's wishes, he returned the award to the Academy the very next day. Scott's Oscar rejection created a media sensation and raised serious questions about the legitimacy and purpose of the Academy Awards at a time when the ceremony was facing criticism for becoming too commercialized and politically motivated, making his protest both personally principled and culturally significant. Fact 15. TV debut. Kept all profanity. When Patton made its television debut on ABC on Sunday, November 19, 1972, the network made an almost unprecedented decision to keep virtually all of General Patton's colorful and profane language intact. This was extremely unusual for broadcast television in the early 1970s, when networks routinely censored or completely removed any offensive language from theatrical films before airing them to home audiences. The decision was particularly surprising because Patton contained extensive profanity throughout the film, not just occasional curse words, but sustained passages of military language that included some of the strongest expressions commonly used by soldiers. The real General Patton had been famous for his creative and liberal use of profanity, and the filmmakers had tried to capture this aspect of his personality while still keeping the movie suitable for theatrical release. ABC's Broadcast Standards Department made only minimal cuts to the film's language, removing just 2 sentences from the famous opening speech in front of the American flag. Remarkably, one of those 2 deleted sentences didn't even contain any profanity at all, making the editing choices seem almost arbitrary rather than systematic. The rest of Patton's profanity-laden dialogue remained completely unchanged, giving television audiences the full impact of George C. Scott's performance without the usual network sanitization. This lenient approach to censorship was made even more remarkable by the timing of the broadcast. The film aired only 2 years after its theatrical release, which was extremely fast for a major Hollywood production to reach television. Most theatrical films during that era had to wait at least 5 years before their first television broadcast, especially roadshow releases like Patton that had played in theaters for many months. The uncensored broadcast proved to be enormously popular with viewers, earning a Nielsen rating of 38.5 and capturing 65% of the television audience share. This made Patton the 4th highest-rated film broadcast on television in the United States at that time, demonstrating that audiences appreciated seeing the unedited version of Scott's powerful performance rather than a watered-down television adaptation.